Rupert William Simon Allason was a Conservative member of the British House of Commons between 1987 until 1997. However, he's best known around the world as Nigel West, military historian and journalist, specializing in security and intelligence matters. During the recent commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Normandy landings, Nigel West's name surfaced in relation to his 1985 book on Agent Garbo, the personal story of who some say was the most successful double agent of World War II. The agent's real name was Juan Pujol.
Hi, I'm Susan Swain. This summer, I'll be on the air from Milwaukee and Chicago for C-SPAN's live gavel-to-gavel convention coverage. It's been a mainstay of our network since 1984. What has changed in recent years is C-SPAN's funding, now challenged by the many homes who have opted to cut the cord. This summer, an anonymous donor is generously helping support C-SPAN with a matching gift campaign. Every dollar given will be matched up to $25,000. Please consider giving to support our no commentary convention coverage and all of C-SPAN's public affairs programming. To learn more or to make a donation, find us at cspan.org/donate. Thank you.
Nigel West, what was Operation Garbo?
Operation Garbo, it was never actually called Operation Garbo. Garbo was the code name of a wartime double agent. He was a Spaniard. He had volunteered to the Germans. He spied in England, but actually he was a double agent. And he was one of three agents under British control who were in wireless contact on a daily basis with the Germans in the 3 months prior to the D-Day landings. And his contribution to the deception campaign, codenamed Fortitude, was exceptional, second to none, and saved tens of thousands of lives during the Battle for Normandy.
How did you come on the story?
In 1972, a report was declassified by the British Security Service, which revealed for the first time that there were about 60 double agents who had been manipulated by the British Security Service during the Second World War. In other words, the entire German espionage organization in the United Kingdom over a long period had been completely controlled by MI5, the British Security Service. This was an extraordinary revelation. It was intended to restore the reputation of the British security and intelligence community that had taken a bit of a battering over the years from Kim Philby and George Blake and so on. And so this was an attempt to burnish the reputation. And in that document, which was released in 1972, there was a reference to a double agent who had made this extraordinary contribution, had effectively persuaded the enemy that the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944 were a diversionary feint that the Axis could ignore because the real invasion was going to take place 2 weeks later in the Pas-de-Calais. And the Germans were predisposed. All the military orthodoxy of the time dictated that only a lunatic would try and land 160,000 troops anywhere other than the Pas-de-Calais, which was the shortest route across the English Channel. And in military terms, in military orthodoxy, in military methodology, it was the area that was the most obvious route to Berlin if you were going to try and end the war quickly. And it also meant that there would be maximum amount of time for air cover to be deployed over the combat zone, minimum amount of time for aircraft to be flying back to be refueled and rearmed. And if you just bear in mind that a Spitfire fighter at that time could fire its weapons for about 15 seconds. So you can imagine that the less time that is spent flying back to base to be refueled and rearmed, the more effective your air exploitation is going to be. And that's what Garbo achieved.
How did you spot the name, and what was his name?
Well, I didn't spot his name. The code name Garbo is right there in the documents. The issue for me was his real name. The two or three references to the Garbo case that I read in various other places said that he had died in Angola of malaria after the Second World War. And you have to understand that Garbo was quite extraordinary because he wasn't acting alone. He had 27 sub-agents. These were individuals, these were people, a Swiss retiree living in Liverpool, a Venezuelan student in Scotland, an Indian nationalist down in Dover. He had 27 agents spread across the country that he could deploy. So when the Germans asked a question, which is the unit, let's say, based in just outside Norwich, southeast of Norwich on an airfield, what are the military insignia on the vehicles or the shoulder flashes of the troops in the vicinity, Garbo could deploy an agent to go and make this personal observation and then report in. And Garbo was transmitting up to 3 hours a night from central London back to his German controllers in Madrid. So I knew his code name was Garbo, but it took me a while, it took me 12 years to find his real name, which was Juan Pujol Garcia. He turned out to be a Catalan, but when I was first looking for him, I was researching a book on the history of the British Security Service during the Second World War. And whenever I interviewed a case officer, I would always, at the end of the interview, I would say, "Do you know anything about the Garbo case?" And invariably they replied, "Of course, everybody knows, everybody's heard of the Garbo case." And then I'd say, "Who was he?" And then they'd say, "Very few people had the need to know." That was the principle that was applied. And because his case officer, who was a man called Tommy Harris, a very talented artist, had died in a road crash in 1964, I was never able to ask him the real name of Garbo. And it wasn't until I interviewed in 1981, I interviewed Anthony Blunt, who had been a Soviet spy and who'd worked in the security service during the Second World War. He was the one person who broke the rules about need to know. I asked him about the Garbo case because I knew that he had been friendly with Tommy Harris. And Blunt had an extraordinary memory. And he said, "Yes, I remember the case well. I actually met Garbo. I met him in the Garibaldi restaurant in Jermyn Street in September 1944. I mean, he practically remembered the menu." And I said, "Do you remember his name?" And he said, "Yes, I think his name was Juan or Jose Garcia," which didn't really help me because practically every Spaniard you meet is called Juan or Jose Garcia. But I used that a year later in 1984. I was working on a different book and I interviewed a former British Secret Intelligence Service officer who had served in Madrid after the war. And I asked him about the Garbo case. And he was very amenable to chatting about Garbo because he said that he had dealt with Garbo after the war at a time when the textbook said that Garbo was supposedly dead. So we chatted away, and intelligence agencies give a course on elicitation, a little bit like journalists, how to extract information from people without putting them on their guard. And I asked this officer, retiree, "Do you remember Garbo's name?" And he said, "Yes, of course. I would never dream of telling you." And I said, don't worry. I know his name. It was Juan or Jose Garcia, wasn't it? And he corrected me. He said, "Juan Pujol Garcia." And I said, "Oh, yes, that's right." And I pretended that I'd known all along. But the reality was that at that time in 1984, the Prime Minister of Catalonia was named Pujol. It's quite a common name in that part of Spain. And so I hired a researcher in Barcelona to go through the telephone directory to find every J. Pujol Garcia, and there were 326, it turned out. And I asked him to call all those numbers. And I'd created a profile. I thought that Garbo, if he was still alive, would be in his mid-70s, that he would be quite mysterious about what he'd done in the Second World War, that he would be perhaps he'd speak English, and that he would be quite a difficult customer. And after all, he'd kept silent about his role for more than 40 years. So a year later, this is getting towards May 1984, my researcher called me and he said, I've called all the numbers and nobody fits your profile. And I was very disappointed because I really couldn't think of anywhere else to go. And I asked him, I was clutching at straws, and I said, was there anybody amongst the calls that you made that was odd, that stands out to you? And he said, well, there was one young man. His name was Juan Pujol Garcia, but he couldn't have been your guy because he was a very young man. He was in his 20s. But he was the only person who was rude to me. He was aggressive and he wanted to know why I was calling. All the other people that I called, I could eliminate them and they were delightful. This guy wanted to know why I was calling, on whose behalf he was calling. And I said, call him back, talk to him again. And he called back, and this young man turned out to be somebody whose uncle was also called Juan Pujol Garcia, who had moved to South America about 10 or 20 years earlier, occasionally visited Barcelona, and had sent his nephew a postcard 4 years earlier, postmarked Venezuela. So I hired another researcher in Caracas, gave him the profile, and I said, can you do some research, try and find this Catalan? You've got his name, you've got roughly his age, I've given you a profile. And he called me back very quickly and said, I think I found your guy. He's the secretary of the Catalan Society in Caracas. He was one of the very first people that I had on my list to call. And I think that he's your man, but I haven't actually spoken to him except just to verify the number. And that gave me a bit of a problem because whilst I thought that I had his telephone number in Caracas, why would this guy ever talk to me? He'd remained silent since the end of the Second World War. He was obviously a master spy. If he could invent 27 sub-agents, he would be able to run rings around me. And on that basis, I called Buckingham Palace, which seemed the obvious route to me because the Duke of Edinburgh, the late Prince Philip, was a huge spy buff. And he used to buy every non-fiction book on espionage. He used to go and have lunch regularly at the SIS headquarters in London. And I spoke to his private secretary and told him a little bit of a white lie. I'm sure this will go no further. But I said that Garbo was alive and well and was coming to London. And this was about 3 weeks before the 40th anniversary of the D-Day landings on the 6th of June, 1984. And Prince Philip came back very quickly and said, everybody knows he's dead. What do you mean he's coming to London? I said, he is coming to London, and that it would be wonderful if Buckingham Palace could arrange an investiture so that he could receive the medal that he'd been given by MI5 in conditions of great secrecy back in 1944. And Prince Philip said, if he's really coming to London and he's alive and you've got the right guy, of course we will arrange an investiture for him. How wonderful. And so my next telephone call, before Buckingham Palace changed their mind, I called the number that I had for Juan Pujol Garcia in Caracas and said that I was calling from Buckingham Palace. And there are two calls that people never refuse: a call from the White House and a call from Buckingham Palace. So I called Buckingham Palace, and he answered the telephone. He took about quite a long, it seemed to me like a minute and a half, to decide whether or not he was going to respond, but he did. And he agreed that he was Garbo. He agreed to meet me. He wanted me very specifically to come and see him, not in Caracas, but in New Orleans. So I immediately traveled to New Orleans, where we had a rendezvous in the Hilton Hotel, which is a gigantic hotel. It's a whole city block. It's the worst place to have a rendezvous with somebody who you don't know what he looks like, because it has about 8 entrances, and it's like Penn Station. It's ridiculously enormous and crowded. Anyway, we did eventually make contact with each other, and it turned out that the reason why he had agreed to see me, having remained silent for 40 years about his role as a double agent, a wartime double agent, was that his son was reading medicine at Tulane University. And he was of mixed race. Garbo had married a woman who was black, and his 2 children by her were obviously of mixed race. And the younger boy, who was the student at Tulane University, had a white girlfriend who had been the subject of harassment in a supermarket by some redneck racists who had abused her for having a black boyfriend. And Juan Jr. had been very upset when she had told him about this incident. And he had then telephoned his father in Caracas. And his father had wanted to say to Juan Jr., "You're just as good as any American. And furthermore, I was told that I had saved tens of thousands of American lives during the Second World War." But he knew that his son would never believe it. And so my call from London at that particular moment meant that he wanted me, first of all, to fly to New Orleans and to explain to his 2 sons what he had done in the war, because he knew they would never believe him if he made up some story about having been a German double agent during the Second World War and having completely changed the history of the D-Day landings and made certain that the Germans hadn't counterattacked on the beaches of Normandy and had prepared in 200 miles in the wrong place for a subsequent invasion. I mean, this was so fantastic that they would never have believed it unless it had come from me. And I didn't know why Garbo was instructing me to tell them this, but this subsequently emerged. So I brought Garbo to London in June 1984 and took him to Buckingham Palace. He had his investiture. His photograph was taken, front page story of him holding his medal outside Buckingham Palace. And then I took him to the Special Forces Club in Knightsbridge in London to introduce him to some of the veteran MI5 officers who had been indoctrinated into the case at the time. And they had gone to the drawing room to have a drink on me, thinking that I'd got the wrong person. They were going to have a laugh at my expense. And I can only tell you it was the most moving experience of my life when Garbo walked into the room and these 80-year-old men who were veterans of the Second World War, hardened intelligence officers, to a man burst into tears and embraced him. So we'd got the right guy. And subsequently, we took him on the anniversary of the D-Day landings, the 40th anniversary. President Reagan was there, Mrs. Thatcher was there, President Mitterrand was there, and Garbo was applauded everywhere that he went. And one particularly, this was largely paid for by a television company who filmed him walking through one of the cemeteries, the American cemetery, at the Omaha beach. And I asked Garbo why he was crying, because I said it was a day of great celebration. There were thousands of people, including many veterans from D-Day. And they all recognized him because of the publicity that he had received in London. And he said, I've been told that I saved many thousands of American lives during the battle for Normandy. But he said, I didn't do enough looking at the graves of all these young men. So he was a very humble individual. And he told me that he had decided to become a double agent because he had had such a bad experience during the Spanish Civil War. He had become convinced that Hitler would destroy civilization in Western Europe. And so he had volunteered to the British embassy to help the war cause for the Allies. And British diplomats had thrown him out, saying, you're a non-combatant, you're a neutral, keep out of it, don't get mixed up. And so he'd gone straight round to the German embassy and volunteered himself to them. And that's how the Garbo case became public knowledge. But it did take me 12 years to track him down.
Where did the name Garbo come from?
His case officer was Tommy Harris, who thought that Garbo was the best actor in the world. And that's why, when he was looking for a code name for Juan, he called him Garbo. He thought that he was the best actor because he took on the role of these 27 sub-agents. And incidentally, the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, whose controller was in Madrid all the way through the war, in communication with Garbo, he knew Garbo as Alaric, and his code name for the entire organization was Arabelle.
27 sub-agents. Did they exist?
None of them existed, but they all appeared to have complicated private lives, claims for expenses, difficult girlfriends, travel problems. And one of them was a man called William Garbo, who lived in Liverpool, and his home, so Garbo claimed, overlooked the river estuary of the River Mersey. And he had a very good view of convoys arriving from the United States or leaving for the Mediterranean. And he would submit daily reports to Garbo in London of his observations. And this was actually very embarrassing for MI5, so that when they eventually brought Garbo to London and interviewed him, the first thing that they had to do was to kill off William Garbo, because it was too embarrassing, the kind of reports. Garbo was making this material up. He was living at that stage in Lisbon. He hadn't got to England, and he was fabricating material. And William Garbo was his complete invention. So William Garbo died. He had to die, and a death notice was put in the Liverpool Evening Post, the newspaper, and that was clipped by Garbo, who mailed the death notice to the Germans, who then responded by sending a letter of condolence to Mrs. Garbo, and also offered her a pension, which Garbo accepted. But when he got to Estoril, when he got to Lisbon, he had never been to England. So we're talking about 1942. He was living in a rented apartment in this fishing village, Estoril, very picturesque village outside Lisbon. And he was there with his then wife. And because he'd never been to England, he was pretending that he was in London. And he was making up all these reports, but some of them were absolutely fantastic, these reports, because he'd never been to England. And eventually he relied on visits to the Lisbon Public Library, where there was a railway guide that he used for a lot of his expenses claims. And he pretended to the Germans that he had recruited a KLM Dutch pilot who flew regularly between London and Lisbon. And that was the reason why all his reports were mailed from Lisbon to his controller in Madrid. And then subsequently, his wife went crazy because Juan was making up all of this stuff, and she got very worried. And Juan went to the British embassy in Lisbon and said, look, you've chucked out my husband once, but he's a fabricator now and he's running out of things to say. Can you help him? And they wouldn't. They didn't believe her. So she went to the American embassy and spoke to a man called Commander Russo, who subsequently became a well-known curator of a museum in the United States. He was an art historian, and he was the assistant naval attaché. And he spoke to Mrs. Garbo at length, realized that Garbo was a fabricator, a self-confessed fabricator, but could be of value to the Allies, and wrote a long report to London saying, what do you want me to do with this guy? And at that stage, the British were very worried because they had been intercepting a lot of the radio traffic that it was exchanged between Berlin and Madrid. And in that traffic, there were references to this master spy in England called Alaric and an entire network of agents called Arabelle. So the British Security Service, MI5, was chasing its tail all over the United Kingdom, trying to find a non-existent spy ring. And here was a woman walking into an embassy in Lisbon explaining exactly where all this information came from.
Let me ask you this for people listening. Can they get a copy of this book today? We got it. It's a used book. We got it through one of the used book sellers here in the United States. But what if somebody wants to read this book?
Yes, they can get it from Amazon tomorrow, delivered at a good price. And that's called Operation Garbo. There are a couple of other books that have been written since by a couple of novelists have pursued the story, and Garbo's original MI5 file, which wasn't declassified until about 2005, that has also been turned into a book and released by the National Archives. So there's plenty of material on the Garbo case out there. But we wrote the book together because he had unique knowledge of his own case, but he didn't know the intelligence dimension to it. For example, the material that he transmitted to Madrid was recycled from Madrid to Berlin on an Enigma cipher machine. So by reverse engineering, having intercepted the encrypted signal between Madrid and Berlin, MI5 was able to read every day the key to the Enigma cipher used by the Abwehr for the whole of Western Europe. Now, Garbo, of course, never knew anything about that, and nor did he know about other double agents. He didn't realize that there were numerous other double agents also being run by MI5, including a spy codenamed Brutus and another spy codenamed Tate, who were also operating over the same period during and after D-Day. But those other two spies weren't in command of organizations or alleged networks, although the material that they supplied the Germans had been prepared by MI5.
There's been a movie made on this. There's several documentaries. I've watched you in a documentary or two. How much for you, once you wrote this book, did you get back in return? Not money, but so much as attention and then stuff, like the movie stuff.
Well, it took me 12 years to find Garbo, so I think I've probably got plenty of critics who said that they could have achieved much the same in a few months. But I wasn't working full time on trying to find Garbo. But for me, it's made a huge difference because we now know about the deception campaign for the D-Day landings. We know about Fortitude. We know about General Patton being put in charge of a non-existent First United States Army group. We're aware of strategic deception. And that campaign that had such an influence on the battle for Normandy would be repeated elsewhere, including in the Gulf War. And you remember Norman Schwarzkopf's famous left hook to drive Iraqi troops out of Kuwait, when the strategic deception was that there would be an American, or rather there would be an Allied landing on the beach at Kuwait, whereas in fact Norman Schwarzkopf took his tanks actually into Iraq and approached Kuwait from an unexpected angle. And that's a really good example of strategic deception. No military planner today would contemplate any large military campaign without consulting the Second World War deception operations that were so successful, including Garbo.
I need to pass on to those who may not know the name Garbo that it was Greta Garbo who did 28 films in 16 years and hung it all up in 1941. So back then, she would have been well known. Today, if you're my age, you can remember her, but I doubt very many people remember her. When you met with him, let me ask you this, because we haven't heard this story. How did he initially communicate with the Germans? And obviously I'm looking for you to explain the invisible ink. Where was he living at the time, and where was he getting his ideas of what he was passing on to the Germans?
Well, he originally approached the Germans in Madrid, and that's when they recruited him, having been rejected by the British. He claimed that he had got a diplomatic, or rather a consular visa, to be able to travel to the United Kingdom. And he did show them a forgery that he had mocked up himself, which the Germans accepted. But he only got as far as Lisbon because he didn't have a visa to get to the United Kingdom. So he spent a year in Lisbon trying to attract the attention of the Germans by giving them information that he thought sounded plausible. I mean, a lot of it was nonsense. He said that a Glasgow docker would be prepared to supply any amount of information in return for a litre of red wine. When he was claiming his expenses, he said that it cost £24 to travel from London to Brighton on the south coast of England, which is only a relatively short distance. And he said that London was so hot in the summer that diplomatic missions used to move to Brighton, which is ridiculous. But he got away with all of this because he was so plausible. The real difficulty that I had with Garbo was that after we came back from the palace in London, he was on the front pages of the newspapers. And I showed him the front page of the Daily Mail, which is a big circulation tabloid. And he wasn't impressed. He was quite worried about it. And he said, "Will they see this in Spain?" And I said, "You bet. You're quite a war hero. There are not many Spanish war heroes, but you're one of them." And he didn't look pleased about that. And he explained his wife was in the next door room. And he explained that she was the second Mrs. Garbo. And she didn't know that there had been a first Mrs. Garbo. And that was a real problem, particularly because the first Mrs. Garbo was alive and well and living in Madrid in 1984. But Juan had faked his death in 1948 in Venezuela. And Mrs. Garbo, whose Christian name was Araceli, had taken their 3 children by that first marriage to Spain. And there they had been told by a British diplomat that her husband had died in South America. And she had then married an American diplomat at the embassy, at the US Embassy in Madrid. So when Araceli read the newspapers in June 1984 that her husband, who she thought had died years earlier, the father of her 3 children, was still alive, she took to her bed for a week. And she was not pleased. And I had the very difficult task of introducing Juan to his daughter. So he had 2 children in Madrid, Juan and Jorge, and Maria. And Juan wrote her a very 17-page, very long, complicated letter explaining why he had done what he had done, and that he wasn't getting along with Araceli, that she was very neurotic. She was a very difficult woman. But it didn't justify what Juan had done. But they all came to terms with it, and then learned that there were 2 other siblings in Caracas that they were completely unaware of. So the family background became very complicated, which I didn't mention in my book, because Juan never told me about his first family. And we didn't mention that in the book because I didn't want to upset him, and I didn't want to aggravate relations within the family, which were very complicated, as you can imagine.
Going back to my question about how he communicated with the invisible ink.
Yes.
How did he do it?
So Juan, first of all, his initial reports from Lisbon to Madrid weren't in secret ink. Some were. Some agents that he pretended he'd received from his sub-agents were in secret ink, but most were in plain text. And he had a very distinctive handwriting and very flowery style. And then when he went to England, he continued that method of communication, supposedly through an independent courier, the pilot, who was using the mail from Lisbon, to send the messages to Madrid. And then he acquired a radio transmitter, and he recruited a sub-agent who was very skilled on the radio, who thought, just to make this really complicated, that he was operating for a communist organization, supposedly. I mean, he didn't even exist. But MI5 provided Juan with a wireless transmitter and a radio operator, and they would get up on the air at about midnight most nights and would transmit for up to 3 hours at a time.
Who was Federico?
Federico was the Abwehr handler. His surname was Napreti, and he was the handler who was responsible for dealing with Garbo all the way through the war. And then at the end of the war, Garbo traveled to Madrid in order to make contact with the Abwehr on behalf of MI5 to see if there were any remnants of the Abwehr left, if there was going to be a resistance organization, if the Nazis were planning to create some kind of anti-occupation guerrilla movement. And Napreti saw Garbo at the end of the war and gave him some money, paid him off, and said, "Don't call us, we'll call you. But there will not be a resistance. There won't be a guerrilla warfare organized by us against the Allies." So that was very helpful, useful information.
What's the translation for Abwehr?
Abwehr, it's the direct translation is defense, but it was the word that was used by the German military intelligence service. It was divided into 3 groups. So there was intelligence collection, there was sabotage operations, and then there was counter-espionage. So Abwehr 1, Abwehr 2, and Abwehr 3. They were all part of the same organization, a very big organization employing about 60,000 people, operating around the globe, mainly from Abwehrstellen, which is an Abwehr star, which was their idea of a base of operations. And so they had attached to their embassies in Lisbon, Madrid, Istanbul, and Stockholm and Bern, they had these stations with up to the Madrid station had 300 German intelligence officers working from it.
How many books have you written?
About 44. I think I'd have to consult my ex-wife to get an exact figure. I can't remember.
And when did you operate with the last name Allason?
That was the name that I was born with, and I've had a separate career under that name. But Nigel West is a professional name.
But you were a member of Parliament, and did you use...
I was a member of Parliament for 10 years between 1987 and 1997.
And then people there knew you as Allison? Last
yes.
name? Okay. And do people now today, everywhere you go, call you Nigel? Is that the name you use?
Yes.
How did you invent that name?
I was making contact with a Soviet spy in London, and I was about to call him, and then I realized that it was very unwise to do so. My father had been a member of Parliament, and I didn't want to embarrass him. So I had to make up a name very quickly, and I wanted a neutral name. And I've been listening to a radio program about somebody called Nigel Pargeter. So Nigel was on my mind. And West just seemed to me to be a very neutral name, and a short name at that.
Which of all those 44 books sold the most?
I wrote a book in 1982 called A Matter of Trust, MI5, 1945 to 1972. And that was probably my biggest selling book. The reason being that it was injuncted by the Attorney General. It contained too much secret information that hadn't been cleared, hadn't been declassified at that stage. And there was a bit of a screw up. And the Attorney General was not keen on my book being published. But when I explained that the American publisher had got exactly the same manuscript and was about to publish, we came to an accommodation, and some of the material that was published in America was redacted. And we came to an agreement about other excisions from the British edition. But that the moment that you announce that a book is about to be banned or contains classified information that had slipped in error, you've got a bestseller on your hands, in my experience.
It says in your background that you speak periodically in Washington, one to the CIA and other intelligence groups. What do you tell them?
I tell them that there's nothing new in the intelligence world. When I spent some years in Washington teaching counterintelligence, and amongst the tales that I would tell them would be the Garbo case as a salutary example of the fabricator and how not all fabricators are bad. But the truth is that a case officer will look at a particular series of events and report up the chain of command, wow, I've got a really live defector, or I've got a penetration of some kind, I've got a really good source. What you should do is be very skeptical and see that there are opportunities, but also be aware of the risks, and to make an assessment and to understand that everything in the intelligence community has happened before. It may have been 50 years before or 50 months before, but it has happened before, and you need to be very careful indeed. And the second big lesson, and I gave this to a talk at the agency where Rick Ames was in the audience, I said, the moment that there is a penetration that has been solved and a mole has been arrested, you now need to start looking for the next mole, because there will always be a mole. the moment that you throw your hands up in horror and say, this is a disgrace, it's a breach of security, and there is a political storm, and people want scalps because of hostile penetration, that is a disincentive to the intelligence community to run a good counterintelligence organization. And it is only spies that catch other spies. No spy has ever been caught by the so-called vigilance of colleagues.
So what's the essence of having Rick Ames in the audience? Who was he? Who is he?
Aldrich Ames was a senior CIA counterintelligence officer. He turned out to have spied for the Soviets for more than 8 years and accumulated more than $2 million in doing so, is alive and well and in jail at the moment. And he is one of several hostile penetrations of the CIA, but he did immense damage and probably was responsible for the deaths of about 12 agents that had been recruited by the FBI and the CIA over a period of years. And in May 1985, he made contact with the KGB in Washington, D.C., and sold out all of these assets that had been cultivated and groomed over a period of years. And overnight, the lights went out. Individual agents just started disappearing. And that in the intelligence business is called a clue. It means that you've got a penetration. And there is always a disincentive. There is a reluctance on the part of the intelligence community to conduct these mole hunts because they look back to 1974 and they look back to the days of Jim Angleton and the so-called crown jewels, the offenses that was supposedly committed by Jim Angleton and the CIA. But the reality is, and we now know from a defector called Vasily Mitrokhin in 1992, that Jim Angleton was right. There was hostile penetration of the CIA, and he was able to identify the right spy, a man called Sasha Orlov, who ended up being a picture framer in Alexandria, Virginia.
There's a paragraph on page 177. I'm going to read a little bit of it because this is, to me, it just jumped right out. I know I'm jumping to the end, but I'm afraid I'm not going to get it in by the time we're through talking. And you say this is the final transmission, Garbo said to the Germans. I understand the present situation and the lack of guidance due to the unexpected end of the military struggle. News of the death of our dear chief shocks our profound faith in the destiny which awaits our poor Europe. I have to ask you who the dear chief is he's talking about.
That's Adolf Hitler.
It says here, but his deeds and the story of his sacrifice to save the world from the danger of anarchy, which threatens us, will last forever in the hearts of all men of goodwill. Now, he's writing this as a spy that the Germans think he's on their side.
He's a loyal German spy. He is using this very characteristic flowery language. If he can write something in 3 paragraphs rather than 1, that's what he'll do. And he was portraying himself as a loyal German, distraught at the loss of the Führer. And this, of course, was precisely the kind of thing that the German controllers, the people who would have access to this information, wanted to read.
When did the Germans find out that he was a double agent?
1972.
How did they find out?
They read the same book as I did, the declassified report of the double cross system of the war of 1939 to 1945. Up until then, the Germans had, such Germans that had survived the war who had access to agents who had been operated in Allied countries, had remained absolutely silent about Garbo. Some of them knew about the Alaric and Arabelle cases, but they refused to disclose any information to their Allied interrogators after the war. So the Germans were astonished to discover, first of all, that all their agents had been controlled by the Allies, Secondly, that their communications had been intercepted. Thirdly, that the specific daily key used by the Abwehr for their Enigma encrypted communications had all been read on a daily basis. Those three events proved absolutely shocking to German researchers and German historians and German veterans.
Let's go back to the early part of our conversation where you talk about the fact that Garbo saved American, British, Canadian lives, and some others, I assume. Directly again, how did he pull this off? And did people at the time, who knew about it in our military or our government?
Well, the government knew that there was a deception plan, codenamed Fortitude. They were also aware that Fortitude included exaggerating Allied strengths and included the invention of, for example, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, which didn't exist, although General Patton had publicly been appointed to head FUSAG. It just simply didn't exist. It consisted of landing craft made of balsa wood that were floating in river estuaries in eastern England. These were associated with rubber tanks and vehicles that had been deployed in airfields for the Luftwaffe to take aerial reconnaissance photographs to demonstrate a build-up of enemy forces in the southeast of England, close to the ports of embarkation, which was further evidence of an invasion heading for the Pas de Calais. The Germans believed that there would be, that for a successful invasion, it would require the capture of ports. Well, the gamble that was decided upon by Eisenhower, who was a keen supporter of the deception campaign, was not to capture a port intact. We never did, but instead we towed across the channel two prefabricated ports, and these were called codenamed Mulberry, and these caissons were created, two huge ports off the beaches of Normandy. So the idea was to enhance what the German military analysts were predisposed to believe, which was that the Allies would take the shortest route, 23 miles, between Dover and Calais. And instead, we not only created these ports ourselves, but the issue of resupplying the troops with fuel, we created a very ingenious device called Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. And Pluto was a steel fuel line that was uncoiled from the Isle of Wight in the south of England, connecting it to fuel stations in Normandy. I mean, it's very ingenious, and all of these were minor parts of the deception campaign intended to enhance the idea, the very sensible idea, that the Allies were going to land in the Pas de Calais. And the second part of the deception was to give the various pieces of the jigsaw, the aerial reconnaissance, the fake signals, the other reports in open sources, newspapers of American troops and Canadian troops massing in southeast England. All of this was intended to create the impression of an invasion in the Pas de Calais. And then once the invasion had started, the critical second part of the Fortitude campaign was to give the impression that the landings in Normandy were a diversionary feint intended to draw German troops away from Pas de Calais, which was where the Allied troops would land 2 or 3 weeks later. And we know from captured documents at the end of the war that the 1st SS Panzer Division, for example, which was up on the Franco-Belgian border, was stopped in its tracks on D-Day +3 when it had been ordered to counterattack the Allied landings when they were trying to establish their beach hold, the 1st SS Panzer Division was sent back to the Pas-de-Calais. And a month after the landings in Normandy, there were actually more troops, German troops, in the Pas-de-Calais area than there had been a month before the D-Day invasion of Normandy. So the Germans completely believed the advice that they had received from Garbo. And we see this in a telegram that was initialed by General Jodl and Hitler, which sent the 1st SS Panzer Division back to its barracks saying, we have information from our best source in England, Alaric, that the invasion is going to come in 3 weeks' time in the Pas-de-Calais.
In putting this book together, you say, and I've read it, so I know that several chapters written by Pujol and then several by you. Did you actually write all of it?
No. Juan wrote the parts attributed to him. He wrote them in Catalan, and I had an acquaintance who was the researcher in Barcelona who translated the Catalan into English. And so that's why the language is not great, but I didn't want to interfere with anything that he wrote. And the reason why the two of us wrote it like that was that he knew intimately, obviously, his own background and backstory and motivation, which I couldn't possibly know about. But on the other hand, he didn't know about Enigma machines. He didn't know about the cipher systems that he'd helped compromise. He didn't know about the other double agents that had participated to the Fortitude campaign.
Have you talked to any of the Germans in the last several years about this whole thing?
Yes, I have. And the reactions have varied. First of all, they regard this as typically British dirty tricks. Secondly, I had a conversation when I was on a book tour in Australia with a cipher machine operator who had emigrated to Australia after the Second World War. And he said that his career had been working on Enigma cipher traffic, and that what I was saying was nonsense, that it was completely impossible for any outsider to attack the cipher system generated by Enigma unless they'd got about 10 or 15 years to break the cipher. And we just had to agree to disagree. But I think that history is on my side, and so much material has been declassified now, not just about Enigma, but the NSA website includes a huge amount of material from an organization that operated during the Second World War, which was studying the German cryptographers. And it turns out that German cryptographers actually broke the Enigma cipher that was used by Enigma operators in Switzerland by the Swiss army during the Second World War. So the Germans knew that the Enigma cipher system was vulnerable. They just thought it would take years to break any of the traffic.
By the way, did Spain actually stay neutral during World War II?
Yes, it remained neutral all the way through the Second World War, and they were quite fearful that the Germans, who were very anxious to take Gibraltar, that the Germans would enter Spain and seize Gibraltar, because it was such strategically such an important point guarding the entrance to the Mediterranean. So there was always tension between the relationship between Francisco Franco and Admiral Canaris, who was head of the intelligence service, and Hitler himself. So
where did you spend the most time with Garbo leading up to the publication of the book, and how much time did you spend with him? We published the book in 1985, and he spent about 6 months traveling between Caracas and Barcelona, seeing his family and writing the book. And my
Catalan collaborator lived in Barcelona, and I spent most of my time in London, but occasionally Garbo would come to London and deliver parts of his completed chapters, which were all written in longhand.
I want to go back to what we were talking about very early, because it is, when you read the book, it's very complicated to figure it all out, and that is this whole business of subagents. At the beginning of your book, you have a whole list of all of them by name, 27 of them, human beings that didn't exist. And how much of this double agent business was the payoff for Garbo and obviously the Allies?
Oh, these agents were expensive. They had salaries. They had expenses that they submitted on a regular basis. And Tommy Harris and Garbo shared an office in Jermyn Street, directly opposite the MI5 headquarters in St. James's Street. So it's literally sort of 100 yards stroll between the two offices. And they would be there on a daily basis. And they had a card index system. So every individual personality had their own card index. And then for each item of traffic that they were responsible for, or material reports that had been attributed to them in the German traffic, was noted on a card. So there were no internal contradictions. If you're going to fabricate material, like Chris Steele fabricating the Trump dossier, however clever you think you are, you're going to make mistakes if you're fabricating material. And the key to avoiding that is writing down on cards all the references and traffic and where an individual is and what time they sent a particular message and the expenses that they've claimed for that particular journey, and to cross-reference that very carefully with the other sub-agents. It's a complicated business, and it was a full-time employment for Garbo and Tommy Harris, but the amount of money that was generated by Garbo was very considerable indeed, because a very ingenious channel was used to fund Garbo. One of the difficulties for running a double agent is the double agent is expensive. They need to be financed. And unless you've got a good system of delivering money to your double agent, then they become implausible, and their controller is likely to smell a rat.
How did they do it?
They did it through a system of orange traders who were growing vegetables in Spain. And Garbo claimed that he knew a corrupt merchant in London, and that if the money could be paid by the merchant in Spain, so if the Germans paid money into the account in Spain, that this same trader would make the money available in London, and that's how it worked. We had to invent it. This was not the Germans seized on this, but they were always worried about how they were going to pay their double agents.
I could clearly talk to you forever because this stuff never stops, but I have to ask you a last couple questions. And we're the day after an important election in Great Britain, and 250 Tories lost. And it reminds me of when you lost by 12 votes back in 1997. What's it feel like to all of a sudden have this thing flip as significantly as it has?
Well, I anticipated a landslide in 1997, but I don't think that anybody realized that in 2024, much the same thing would happen, but on steroids. I mean, this landslide is absolutely extraordinary. But in electoral terms, it's quite interesting because there is a brand new party that did enormous damage to the Conservative Party. And if you add up the votes that the Conservative Party had and the votes of this other Reform Party, together that amounts to more than the Labour Party achieved in votes. So although this is a landslide, it's a sort of quirk of the electoral system that we have of first past the post. But it's a historic occasion, and we'll be talking about this for years to come.
Do you have a book coming out later on?
I do. I've just published my autobiography, which is called Classified: The Adventures of a Mole Hunter. And that sets out the relationship that I've had over many years with the intelligence community, the teaching work that I did in Washington to the intelligence community, and the way that I got started in this strange world.
What's the name of it again?
It's called Classified. It's called Classified! The Adventures of a Mole Hunter.
And is it available in the United States?
Yes. On Amazon. You can delivered tomorrow morning.
Nigel West, author of a book that was published in 1985 called Operation Garbo. Thank you so much for your time and telling us the story that you found yourself years and years ago.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.